It's a pleasure being here, and congratulations to the organizers with a very interesting program. I think you have some really important days ahead of you. Yes, so I'll talk about the obesity epidemic in Europe and beyond. Where do I press? Yeah, there. Yes. And I have no conflicts of interests. So what is obesity? Well, obesity is a stage of an abnormal functioning of or an excess of the adipose tissue. So it's the result of a disturbance in the regulation of the adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is not only a storage of energy deposits, it's also biologically active. So it's too simple to say that obesity is just the excess energy intake versus the energy expenditure. This ignores the complexity of the neuroendocrine and metabolic systems that regulate the energy intake, storage, and energy expenditure. So how do we define obesity? According to the World Health Organization and the International Classification of Diseases, version 11, obesity is a chronic complex disease defined by excessive adiposity that can impair health. And it's also acknowledged by the UN Commission in 2021, and they define it as a chronic relapsing disease, which in turn acts as a gateway to a range of other non-communicable diseases, such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So obesity not only bears a health risk in itself, it's also a gateway to a range of other diseases. Obesity is surrounded by a lot of stigma and weight bias, and therefore language and pictures, they matter a lot. Obesity is a disease that is per international definitions by the World Health Organization, the European Commission, and also many national organizations. Unfortunately, not all countries or many countries in the EU do still not acknowledge obesity as a disease, but more as a lifestyle choice. We should use people-first language. This is standard for other diseases. For instance, we talk about people with type 2 diabetes. In a similar way, we talk about people with obesity. We do not say obese individuals. This is not an identity. This is a chronic disease. And this is also recommended and are required by international organizations. Also, we should use positive imagery. We shouldn't use stereotypic images, for instance, a body with no head eating a burger on a bench in a passive position. This is not a typical pattern of people with obesity, and there are numerous image data banks that you can use for free that has non-stigmatizing pictures. So what is the worldwide state of obesity? When we do estimations of obesity, we use the body mass index. That's a useful measure in epidemiological studies, although we know it has limitation on an individual level. This study came out this year, and they estimated the proportion of thinness, shown in blue, and the proportion of obesity. And here we see it in women back in 1990. This is how it looked. Worldwide, so it's for each of the countries, and we can see we have quite large prevalence of thinness and also obesity in some parts of the world. The European countries are in the upper right corner, the outer blue circle, and this is the prevalence among women in Greece. So this is sort of in the middle of the prevalences worldwide. Then moving forward to 2022, we now see a dramatic shift. The prevalence of thinness has gone down, and the prevalence of obesity has increased a lot. So these are the worldwide levels. And here you have Greece. So zooming in on European countries, here you see the prevalence of obesity 2022 in France, Denmark, Spain, Italy, the global prevalence, Greece, and Malta. And we see there are large difference across the EU countries, two factor difference. So it's still relatively low in France and Denmark, and higher in Greece and Malta. Globally, 1 in 4 women have obesity. In the European Union, it's a little bit lower, maybe 1 in 6. This study also had the numbers in children, where we also see an obesity epidemic. And here we see them in boys in 1990, we saw there were, in some parts of the world, there were very high prevalences of thinness, up to 20 or maybe even 30-40% in some parts of the world. Also here we see a major shift until 2022. Now the prevalence of obesity is higher than thinness in all parts of the world. And in the European Union, in some selected countries you see here, as for the women, we have large variation across the countries. It's relatively low in Denmark and higher in Italy and Greece. And the average prevalence of obesity among boys in Europe is around 15%, so 1 in 6 kids. And this is at the age of 7 to 9, and it increases with increasing age. Importantly, we should remark that levels in children, they vary by parental education. So in high-income countries, we see an inverse association. So the lower the education of the parents, the higher the risk of obesity in the children. So what are the causes of obesity? Well, the causes, obesity is caused by a complex interaction between genetic, metabolic, behavioral, environmental factors. So we know that there's a huge genetic risk. It's estimated it's around 40 to 70% of the risk is due to genetics, and these genes mainly affect our brain. So the brain plays a central role in the development of obesity. Some types of medication increases the risk. Our biology affects our risk. If we have poor sleeping patterns, if we're stressed, if we live in obesogenic environments, we're more prone to develop obesity. And also there are other healthcare factors that increase the risk, for instance, healthcare access, mental health, life events, stigma, screen time, and social deprivation, that all of these factors together affects the regulation of the body weight and our biology. So what do we know from obesity management? Well, we know that body fat mass is biologically controlled. This is not only due to our willpower or lack of self-control that we develop obesity. So there's a neuroendocrine regulation of the appetite and the body weight. And to simplify it, we can divide the brain into 3 parts. The first one is the homeostatic system that regulates our eating and our hunger. We eat when we are hungry. So the neurons in the brain, they are activated when they get hormonal and neural signals from the adipose tissue, from the gut, and also from peripheral organs. And this is not under our conscious control. This is unconscious control of the appetite. The second part of the system is the hedonic eating, when we eat for pleasure or for reward of food. And the third part is the executive function. This is the conditioning, deciding of decision to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, and what to eat. And together, these 3 systems, they work together and control our appetite and our body weight. So it's not as much under our conscious control, maybe as we would like to think. Yes, so they regulate the food intake, and we, together with the energy expenditure, then we have the results of the body weight. And if we have a disturbance in any of these systems, it can lead to either a weight loss or a weight gain. Also, we should note that weight loss is biologically resisted. So after weight loss, we see that the energy expenditure goes down, the basal metabolic rate decreases. We also see an increase in hunger and reward due to hormonal changes, and together this gives us an energy surplus, and we see a weight gain, which we can call metabolic adaptation to weight loss. And you see this here in the figure. This is from the diabetes prevention program, where they did a lifestyle intervention, and we can see that the individuals, they lose 7 kilo, but then after the intervention stops, they slowly gain most of the weight again. And this is due to the metabolic adaptation. It's not due to a lack of willpower. An estimate says that 90% of individuals, they regain 90% of the weight they lost. So weight maintenance is really important, and we need to think in a long perspective when it comes to obesity. There is no quick fix. So what are the consequences of obesity? You're probably all aware that obesity has metabolic consequences. Some examples are hypertension, type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, liver disease, gallstones, PCOS, gout, and cancer. Obesity also has mechanical health consequences such as sleep apnea, reflux disease, incontinence, chronic pain, arthritis, and thrombosis. It has mental health consequences such as depression, anxiety, and poor self-esteem. And it also has monetary consequences, for instance, a lower educational attainment or a lower income. And it's associated with more than 200 other diseases. So obesity has an effect on health in itself, and it's also a gateway to other diseases. But if we prevent and treat obesity, we can prevent 230 diseases, including up to 80% of type 2 diabetes, 35% of ischemic heart disease, 55% of hypertensive disease among adults, and 20% of adult cancers. We also know that obesity affects the health of the children, and children who have obesity, they are at high risk of developing type 2 diabetes in adult life. But what if they remit from overweight from child to young adult ages? What is the risk of type 2 diabetes then? Well, we wanted to investigate this, so we took advantage of data we have on 65,000 men, and we were able to follow them from age 7 years until young adulthood. And we divided these men into 8 groups according to the pattern of overweight. And we compared the risk of type 2 diabetes to the group who never had overweight. And here you see the results of our study. So whenever we have an estimate to the right of the one line, we have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And what's interesting here is that boys who had overweight at 7 years, they do not have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes compared to those who never had overweight. Whereas those who had overweight at 13 years, they had a markedly increased risk. But what was also interesting is that that risk was much lower than the risk we saw in the groups who had obesity at all ages. So this really tells us that the sooner a boy remits from overweight in childhood, the lower the risk of type 2 diabetes. So we should intervene early. So how do we do it? Well, prevention is a continuum. The first step is health promotion. We enable people to increase control over their own health, and we do interventions aimed at preventing the root causes of ill health. This is at a population level. The second stage is primordial prevention. We prevent the risk factors for obesity, and we target the population as a whole. Next level is primary prevention. Now the aim is to prevent obesity in the population at risk, so those individuals who have an more susceptible to develop obesity. And this is disease specific. The fourth level is secondary prevention. We want to minimize obesity progression by early detection, and we do this when we have obesity at a subclinical stage, for instance, through a screening program. The fifth level is the tertiary prevention. We want to reduce the complication of obesity, and we intervene on the symptoms now at the clinical stage of obesity. So where are we with obesity? Well, the majority of the actions and interventions fall into these 3 categories of health promotion, primordial, and primary prevention. And this really leaves behind the significant proportion of the population living with obesity. Also, health promotion actions and intervention are often labeled as primary prevention when they are in reality health promotion for everyone, and not specifically primary prevention. It's challenging to attribute effects to factors which are non-specific and distal to obesity, and this may explain why we haven't been terribly successful in preventing obesity. Last week, just a new report came out from a group of the European Commission on current challenges and opportunities for addressing obesity. And this report concludes that we should move from a single to a multiple policy approaches. Single policy approaches are not sufficient in itself. And we should target the upstream determinants of obesity, not only the individual behavior, so we should target the health promoting environments. And they highlight the food environment. This is characterized by the food availability, the prices, and marketing. We can do policies on taxation and food labeling. This is still at an individual level. And they conclude we need stronger policies in the EU. For instance, and then have some recommendations for what we can do. Some of the examples are a complete ban on trans fat and a 0% VAT exemption on fruit and vegetables. We should also consider the digital food environment, especially when it comes to marketing to children and unhealthy food. We should integrate the digital food environment into the public health policies. And there's a knowledge gap here. Third, there's the built environment. This is the urban design and the infrastructure that affects our physical activity patterns. So the policies should target the physical activity opportunities to help us be more active and minimize the physical inactivity. And I can really recommend you reading this report if you haven't already seen it. But prevention is a continuum. Obesity care is preventive care. And we now know from several studies of evidence of managing of obesity that obesity care can prevent disease progression, for instance, of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, and also mortality. But progress has been really slow, and there are many barriers to access to obesity treatment. Obesity is a chronic disease, and we should remember that when planning the activities. And we need to adapt the healthcare system. So where are we with the obesity and the healthcare system? Well, there is really a need for better access and reimbursement. And as the report from the European Commission also concluded, we need access to appropriate multidisciplinary and patient-centered healthcare. So this goes from the behavioral treatment, the psychological treatment, pharmaceutical, and possibly also surgery treatment. And pharmaceutical and surgical treatments play an important role in managing obesity, but they are not standalone solutions. They will not suffice in themselves. In Europe, we have few options for reimbursement of medication, and we also have in periods we have shortages of medication. And this is a barrier for access to treatment. Also, we have limited access to bariatric surgery. On the policy level, a national plan for obesity is an effective tool, but only if it's fully enacted. And the policy actions in EU member states, they're very varied, and in many countries we do not have a national plan, for instance, for childhood obesity. For the management part, healthcare professionals, they need training in understanding obesity's complexities and avoiding weight stigma. And the education until now has not been sufficient. And this applies both to those healthcare professionals already practicing, but also those in training. Also, national clinical guidelines are needed based on evidence-based medicine. So to conclude, obesity is declared a disease by the World Health Organization and the European Commission, and this reflects the adipose tissue biology. Approximately 104 million adults in Europe have obesity and are suffering from its consequences, and we should note that social inequalities exist, suggesting different prevention and treatment strategies are needed. Treatment and management are necessary in addition to primary prevention. So it's not an either or. We need really both and target the entire spectrum of the prevention. We need national clinical treatment guidelines and national action plans. And finally, preventing, treating, and managing obesity across the life course is critical for the health, well-being, productivity, and economy of the nation. Thank you. That's my last word.